Hello, everyone. My name is Professor Amanda Kasha. I'm the Professor of Practice in Museum Studies in the School of Art at ASU. Welcome to I think we're now into our fifth talk for Navigating Change in the Museum series for the spring. To those of you who are not familiar, the Navigating Change in the Museum lecture series is part of the ASU LACMA Fellowship Program. And the program is the result of a collaboration between the Herberger Institute at Arizona State University and the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. And our fellows come from underrepresented communities and work at LACMA and other museums across the country while completing their master's degree in art history in the School of Art. And the Navigating Change in the Museum lecture series is generously supported by the Mellon Foundation. So I'm very excited, as I mentioned, to welcome Dare Turner today. The title of Dare's presentation is Curation as Care, Stewarding the Brooklyn Museum's Indigenous Art Collection. I'm going to go ahead and read out Dare's bio. So Dare Turner is an enrolled member of the Yurok Tribe of California, an art historian, and the curator of Indigenous Art at the Brooklyn Museum in New York. In 2024, she co-organized the museum-wide initiative entitled Preoccupied, Indigenizing the Museum at the Baltimore Museum of Art, which included 9 exhibitions, interpretive interventions across the museum, a publication guided by Native methodologies, and an array of public programs. At the Brooklyn Museum, she curated Aaniin, I'm probably not pronouncing that very well, I See Your Light, which utilized beadwork designs by Nico Williams to transform the museum's outdoor plaza, and co-curated Towards Joy, New Frameworks for American Art, a radical reimagining of the American wing, guided by Indigenous ways of knowing and Black feminist history, and Black feminist theory, rather. Turner graduated from Stanford University and Bard Graduate Center and taught Decolonizing Design at the Maryland Institute College of Art. Her writing has been featured in exhibition catalogs, including Preoccupied, Indigenizing the Museum, Towards Joy, New Frameworks for American Art, Into the Time Horizon, Nevada Museum of Art, Reframing the View, 19th-century American Landscapes, and Agents of Faith, Votive Objects in Time and Place. So in October 2026, her forthcoming co-curated exhibition, Hopi Kachina Dolls, Blessings for a Balanced World, will open at the Brooklyn Museum, and hopefully we can hear all about it. So welcome, Dare, and it's really an honor and a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thanks so much for inviting me. So I'm gonna share my screen. Can we see it okay? Yep.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
And if there's any technical issues, I'm not going to be watching the chat, so just interrupt me. Okay, I'm really excited today to share some of my curatorial practice that is grounded in care. So we're going to start very simple and ask the question, why should a person be a curator? And I have a 3-part answer to this. I think that curators and curatorial work and exhibitions can foster empathy in a way that other modes of storytelling can't. So I think that's a sort of superpower. I think that as a curator, we get to express gratitude both to the artists that made the works, the communities that they emerge from, and the audience that comes and experiences our installations. And I think that we are empowered to embody care with our work. Not all curators take this approach. I think there's many different valid ways to go about curatorial work, but I'm very interested in the overlap between empathy, gratitude, and care because I think those are aligned with Indigenous ways of being and knowing. They're emergent from conversations I have with Indigenous partners and artists. And I think they make for stronger presentations that make a lasting impact. So in 2024, it was a bananas year for me because I opened 11 exhibitions 9 of which were at the Baltimore Museum of Art. And I'll zoom into a couple of those shows, but first I want to start off with some broader picture of methodology and how I came to this idea of curatorial work as being grounded in care and gratitude. So Preoccupied Indigenizing the Museum was a widespread initiative. It was really envisioned as a native takeover of the Baltimore Museum of Art that I co-curated with Leela Grothy, the Associate Curator of Contemporary Art, with the support of a curatorial fellow, Elise Boulanger, who's a citizen of the Osage Nation. And we had a lot of different questions we were grappling with this project. And we wanted to work through these questions in collaboration and in dialogue with community partners. And we decided to do something novel that I encourage all of you, if you end up being a curator, you should do this, what we did, the unconference. So at an early phase in our planning, we had already decided on a lot of the artists whose work would be represented, but we hadn't thought through the actual exhibitions yet. And we were thinking through the book as well. And so we invited all of those folks, every artist whose work was represented in the exhibitions, everyone writing for the catalog, the person designing the catalog, community partners, all the different people that were touching the project. We invited them to come and stay with us in Baltimore. And we were able to utilize the Last Resort Artist Retreat Space, which is a purpose-built space run by the artist Derek Adams for events and gatherings like this. And the wonderful thing about utilizing that space is it felt like a home. There was a beautiful kitchen. There were many different areas where people could gather in small groups. There was an area where we could listen. There was a musician who participated, and we got to hear original tracks that nobody else had heard before. We shared some slide decks. Artists shared stories of, recent art fairs that they had gone to and their impressions and engagement with the field. And this was an opportunity to build deep relationships with people that move beyond those of roles. I wasn't Dare the
The
curator, I
extension.
was Dare the person. These artists were not just the function of artists, they were people who have families and ideas and are grappling with many of the same issues that we are, both within our careers and without. So, through cooking together and really being flexible and adaptive in the moment over the course of 3 days, we built a much stronger foundation to build this project upon. What I wanted to avoid was throwing people into the museum, and just having that be our first point of engagement, because a lot of times when Native folks come into these encyclopedic museums with lots of material from their communities, historical material, it can feel really sad. I feel sad in museum storage sometimes when I see all of these relatives, all of these belongings under glass. And I want those people to know that I'm going to do the very best I can to caretake in alignment with their community's goals and wishes, and for that to be our starting place rather than throwing everybody into storage. So this really laid the groundwork of the show. This out of conversations that took place at this event, we landed on the title Preoccupied Indigenizing the Museum, because at first we thought, oh, is this decolonizing? Is that really what we want to do with this show? But we had felt uncomfortable with that idea, and over the course of these dialogues, we learned why. Because it centers the wrong audience. We're not actually interested in talking just about colonization. We're interested in moving beyond those narratives and centering on the sort of stories that Indigenous folks want to see in museums. So that was very formative, and I will do an unconference whenever possible moving forward. Um, and in terms of another really critical element of the project was community engagement, both within and without the museum. So we connected with many different Indigenous community members in Baltimore City, and largely those were folks that were not at all involved in museums. These were powwow, participants and callers, and lots of different healthcare professionals, because healthcare ends up being this major point of connection for Indigenous communities in Baltimore because there are two large and important organizations, Native American Lifelines and the Johns Hopkins Center for Indigenous Public Health. And so that was a huge focus of our discussion is what does it mean to support Indigenous people's health within museums? And the story that came up time and time again was that folks felt invisibilized. There is a sizable community of Native Americans in Baltimore, but they were often mischaracterized by the public. And a lot of times when I was engaging with non-Native folks, I would hear things like, "Oh, we didn't know that Natives still live in cities or in Baltimore on the East Coast." So there was a lot of education that had to happen around this project, in the way we're talking in the galleries and the way we're engaging, doing random lectures around town. And by embodying care and, educating people in a gentle way that Native folks actually mostly live in urban centers. There are far more urban natives than those living on the reservation. Educating people along those lines was a really important part of the project. And beyond collaborations with external parties, we collaborated across the museum. One element of that was really interesting was we did a decolonization training 101 with Dina Dart, who runs Live Oak Consulting. And she shared a lot of information that was new to folks about what does colonization look like in museums? How does this impact our work today? And we wanted this to move beyond the curatorial field, pop the curator bubble, where we actually invite folks from like finance to participate in these activities and to understand and infuse Indigenous priorities into the work they do on the back end. So it was really constructive and formative in our thinking. Then, as I mentioned before, 9 exhibitions. Too many. Don't do this to yourself. Don't pull a dare and do so many shows in one year. But we had a combination of thematic shows, which we see on the top. Enduring Buffalo is a combination of historical and contemporary works that reflected on the importance and vitality of Buffalo within the Plains cultures and how the systematic near total eradication of the buffalo was a concerted colonial strategy to subjugate those communities. So that was a more historical bent. Then Finding Home and Illustrating Agency were very much a blend of historical and contemporary. Finding Home thought through all the ways in which Native communities maintain a sense of home despite many different pressures, ranging from seasonal migration to the forced abduction of children and how they were sent to boarding schools. So there was a lot of varied content in that show. Illustrating Agency thought about the ways in which artists have asserted agency in their work, while some of the earliest pieces in that show were early to mid 20th century pieces coming out of the Santa Fe studio, in which Native artists were really catering towards a white art market. We see agency affected in different ways or embodied in contemporary artist work in totally radically different ways today. Then we had one other group show that was curated by Sky Hopinka, Don't Wait for Me, Just Tell Me Where You're Going. That was a time-based media program. We had solo shows of Caroline Monet, Deani Whitehawk, Nicholas Galanan's work, and then I'll take a closer look at Laura Ortman and Dana Claxton's show in a second. But in thinking through that full court press of Native representation in the museum, we also put together an audio tour in which we invited Native community members that were engaging with the project to speak about whatever they wanted in the museum. So we did tours. They would identify different pieces. I believe almost no one spoke about a Native artwork because Native insights are relevant across the board. We got to see interventions in the European gallery and the American wing. So that was a great element of the project. We got to make the book of my dreams, woohoo. This was designed by Sebastian Alban, and it included many different experimental elements. We commissioned a comic that reimagined Indiana Jones as a native person that's actually rescuing objects from museums and returning them to tribes. That was riffing off a character that already exists, Pueblo Jones. So that was a lot of fun. Hyde Erdrich wrote a newly commissioned poem. We had essays from Paul Chott Smith, Heather Autone, and John Lukovic. I wrote, along with Leela, wrote some collaborative essays, and then I also wrote more diaristic essays because that is a voice that I can bring. I'm so grateful to all of the heavy hitting academic writers out there. And I want to bring something different. That's not in my area of deep interest. I would rather bring things into conversation with, maybe less scholarly dialogues. What is it to look at this Indiana Jones narrative and to reclaim that? So one of my essays was about rewatching Raiders of the Lost Ark and thinking about, yikes, why aren't we questioning the fact that he's looting these native ceremonial sites? Like, why is we as an audience rooting for the good guy looter instead of the bad guy looter? And just invites new questions like that. So I loved thinking through all of that. And I want to give you a process and glimpse into the gallery for the two shows I mentioned before, Dana Claxton, Spark. So Dana Claxton believes that beauty is medicine. By representing relationships of care and embracing Indigenous cultural belongings, her work really challenges popular assumptions about Indigenous people and displays their culture in all of its splendor. In Spark, Claxton presented one of the most alluring aspects of her practice, the large-scale backlit color transparency photographs that she calls fireboxes, whereas other artists call them light boxes. And Claxton really turns that light box term on its head to instead adopt Indigenous worldviews and indicate an elemental energy embedded in the form. This term prompts us to think about the ability of language to shape cultural understanding. And she represented Indigenous presence as powerful, enduring, and emergent from complex historical legacies. The cultural belongings of Indigenous people displayed in the fireboxes and in the gallery, along with historical artworks from the BMA's collection, all placed beauty and empathy at the center. And in doing so, they celebrated the individual cultures of each of the sitters in her work. And here we get to see on the right, the newly commissioned, the work we commissioned for this show, Headdress Sade and Her Girls. This is the latest in her headdress series, which we see on the left. And it celebrates two generations of Indigenous women simultaneously rooted in tradition and the present moment. These figures are adorned in regalia that's both inherited and newly made. And Sade and her two of her three daughters wear ribbon skirts that communicate Native pride and honor the resilience of Indigenous ancestors. And she holds her newborn daughter lovingly swaddled in a cradle board with the same fabric that they used to make their skirts. And here, the ceremonial feather fans protect the infant from the viewer's gaze, much like the beaded regalia protects the faces of Sade and her older daughters. This tender family image reinforces that cultural belongings serve as an extension of the people who made them and who wear them. The image also spotlights many of the ways that Indigenous women, particularly mothers, maintain traditions and ensure cultural continuity for generations to come. So in all of these different ways, this show fostered empathy. We can see ourselves. If you're a mother, you can see yourself in this portrait, not if you're native or non-native. There was so much gratitude that Dana really brought to her relationship with her sitters and the different belongings that were brought into the gallery. And then in the way we treated all of those different artworks and the people that engaged with this show, we embodied, or we aimed to embody care. And then the other show I want to speak about briefly, and I'm realizing actually I don't think I shared for sound. So let me see if I can switch that. Maybe I'll stop share in a second. But Laura Ortman, Wood That Sings, presented Laura's time-based media work, My Soul Remainer, in conversation with a early 20th century Apache violin by Amos Gustina. And Laura is an acclaimed violinist who has played all over the world in many, many museums. She's playing at Carnegie Hall any day now. And it was wonderful to actually invite her to care for the historical violin. So I'm going to stop the share so I can restart it with the sound and optimize for video. See if this works. Can we hear it?
Yeah, you're good.
So this was a very unusual opportunity to invite an artist to or conserve object in the collection. This is something I aspire to do in the future. Again, a good lesson that came out of Preoccupied and figuring out how to best work with conservation departments where they've never done anything like this before. This was a wonderful opportunity to build intergenerational dialogue and to fully embody care in our treatment of this early 20th century violin. And quite frankly, the best person that could possibly conserve this is someone who plays Apache violin and is from that community. So really, Laura, it was incredibly emotional for all of us to be able to support her and see her and do this work and actually play a song at the end of the restoration process to honor the ancestors. So that was a very moving element of that project that did all of the goals that we hope to achieve with our shows. So now let's pivot to some Brooklyn shows that I worked on. You can see something related to this. Nico Williams, Aaniin, I See Your Light. So Nico is an incredibly accomplished beadworker who's Anishinaabe and worked he often works in things like, making IKEA bags fully out of beads or VHS cassette tapes out of beads. He works in a lot of kind of like with detritus, some caution tape. And for this installation, I knew that we were going to take over the steps, that this is something where it makes a big impression. This is on a major thoroughway through Baltimore, or sorry, through Brooklyn, Eastern Parkways. I like to imagine how many people got to see this over the course of the multiple months it was installed. But Nico is someone who works with materials, and he did not want to just create a vinyl picture on the computer and put that up. He wanted to actually create beadwork that was inspired by objects in our collection, and also to bring a sculptural element to the presentation. So this is a good example of working through curatorial constraints. So we knew that sculpture had to be installed in a completely reversible way. We couldn't use glue. We couldn't adhere anything other than vinyl to the steps. We had to make sure that we were still following all ADA accessibility guidelines. that if something were, really heavy, it wouldn't damage the architecture. So there were a lot of different constraints to work through. And also, Nico is in Canada, and we needed to produce work in the United States or we need to produce these jingles in the United States for a variety of reasons. A major one being shipping. It's bananas. It's very, very expensive to ship things between Canada, even if you're right next door over the border. So we had to be clever in thinking through a lot of the constraints for this. So Nico came and visited, and in our site visit, he saw a couple of pieces that had really spoken to me. Anytime artists visit and are interested in the historical collection, I'll send them a list and say, all of these things are available. Let me know if you want me to pick certain things out. I'm happy to look at things for you, and do a little array, or we can look at everything together. So we did a bit of both with Nico. I had identified this legging you see in the center here as something really interesting. I've not seen Anishinaabe designs like this, where it's a combination of ribbon work and bead and kind of unusual beadwork for that region, all together with these trade materials. And this immediately resonated with him. He was really interested in the patterns he saw here. And he also wanted to bring some of the more traditional Anishinaabe patterns to the piece. So he took a lot of photographs and then designed the beadwork you see here, which was then photographed for the steps. And he also was very much drawn to this, what's called a sugar mold. So the interesting about this is the case for both of these pieces. Neither of these had been on view before, and they had been in storage for decades. So this was their moment in the spotlight. And the great thing about the sugar mold, the wooden piece you see here, is you can actually see the drip marks, where an Anishinaabe person had poured maple syrup into it, and then it sets within the structure, and you can pop out, geometric designed sugar cubes. So this was something that Nico wanted to bring to jingles. Jingles are on a lot of regalia that Anishinaabe women wear. It originated with Anishinaabe communities, and his cousin was like an accomplished jingle dress dancer. This isn't his cousin here, but this was a photograph taken by another Anishinaabe artist, John Pillay. And Nico thought that would be the perfect sculptural intervention. So we worked with fabricators based in Brooklyn to create these jingles here and to create kind of a matrix to make sure they could be played, like you could hear the music of the jingles. They would transform in the light. So here you see when it's not in sunlight, it looks like a dark purple. When it is in sunlight, it turned a really beautiful shade of gold. We used automotive paint. The fabricator we worked with at first said, oh, we can't manage like doing any sort of patterns on this for budget and feasibility issues. But as we got to work with them more and more, they were so excited about the project, they actually purchased the equipment to be able to make that happen. And so we see a pattern from the sugar mold right here. And I mentioned at the very top of the program that I am someone who is not afraid of math. And I encourage you all to build math skill sets as you become a curator, because you're going to need to manage budgets. But in the case of this, I actually calculated conical frustrums, which meant that I needed to figure out the diameter of the bottom circle in relation to the top circle, so the cone would be the right shape, and would lay nicely and feel even and would have the same proportions of the tiny jingles that we see on jingle dresses. So there was a lot of different components that went into this project, but it was really great to have this be the largest installation of site-specific and Indigenous artist ever at the museum, and for this to be an invitation to engage. Even if you don't come inside the museum, you can still experience some of the really amazing stuff the historical Native collection offers. Then the other major project I worked on in 2024 was a complete reinstallation of the American Wing, which is 9 separate galleries. And In this reinstallation, we worked around different frameworks emergent from Black feminist theory and Indigenous ways of knowing. And we're thinking about frameworks as invitations for dialogue across disparate collection areas. This was a project captained by Stephanie Sparling Williams, an American art curator, and there were many other wonderful collaborators. Caroline Gillespie was also an American art curator. Nancy Rossoff now curates Ancient Americas, but she also curated Native North America prior to my hire. And then two wonderful decorative arts curators, Liz St. George and Catherine Footer, represented those collections. And we also had support from contemporary art and photography all across the museum. There were so many different partners for this project. But each gallery is conceived of like almost like a mini exhibition on its own. So you can drop in and experience, in the case of the works represented on the left, that framework is Trouble the Water, which is a phrase that comes out of Black American spirituals. And the gallery really thinks about water as a major site of connection and as a material that can be represented in art. It can actually make art objects we have a wonderful sheep horn ladle on view in there where it has to be processed heavily in water many times over the course of its production. And we're also thinking about cultural resonance, both in terms of representation, so what imagery is appearing on works, and the sites in which those works operated. So I came very late game to this project and luckily I had wonderful colleagues that were planning out, which native artworks might fit into the different frameworks. They had come up with a proposed checklist and I, added some deep tracks from the vault is the way I like to call it. So things that have been sitting in storage for decades and decades. Some have never been on view in the 120 years they've been here. I want to bring some of those relatives out into the galleries and give them their time to shine, and also bring out some newer acquisitions and to maintain important sight lines. So this Trouble the Water is the first gallery that people go into where it's, a full installation, and the sight line as you're coming into this space is moving towards this painting of Niagara Falls. And I wanted to interrupt that by including a Haudenosaunee beaded artwork that would have likely been sold at Niagara Falls after the opening of the Erie Canal. This is tapping into Native New York stories. So Haudenosaunee folks live in and around New York and beyond, but it was a major, important ancestral site around Niagara Falls. And so we're thinking here about the women who were able to ensure that their community thrived amidst a lot of difficulty ushered in by colonialism. So in the case of that little bag there, this is a beaded bag that utilizes sculptural form of raised beadwork. So the swan there really feels like it's coming off of this bag. And a lot of times these works end up hiding in the vault because they are tourist art, because they were made for people to buy. And I wanted to really pressure that. Just because this was made for sale doesn't mean it's inauthentic, doesn't mean it's not valuable. In fact, a lot of art is made for sale. Let's look at these paintings around. Why are we holding those to a different standard than native artworks? So we're pressuring that, and we're inviting people to think about native presence and narratives that persist within the region. We also have just a quick glimpse at our To Give Flowers gallery. So this is looking at the ways in which often women artists were relegated to, quote, safe subject matter like flowers, because that wasn't something that would be controversial. So we have a lot of wonderful floral beadwork and garments in there. And then the kind of core gallery I see as representing Native ways of knowing is called radical care. It intersects so nicely with my talk. So this is a gallery that is really held up by two major pillars of Indigenous knowledge. The first is rematriation, and the second is gratitude. So rematriation is a word that's defined in many different ways. You've probably heard the term repatriation, which means the process of sending specific kinds of cultural belongings back to tribes. So if things came out of a funerary context, those are, and from a Native North American tribe, there's a law saying you must return that. So that's repatriation. Rematriation is a much broader term. I think it contains multitudes, and it really calls on all beings to respect and maintain kinship with ancestral homelands and recontextualize humanity's responsibilities to center reciprocity instead of extraction. In doing so, rematriation transforms and challenges our relationship to place. Within museums, rematriation reminds us that while institutions steward material culture in their collections, those artworks are better understood as relatives connected to the ancestors who made them and the descendant communities. And we're thinking about rematriation along those sort of like ecological angles, as well as thinking about the ways in which Indigenous women ensure the continuity of culture through creating cultural belongings. So Carol Marthley Douglas is a very accomplished basket weaver working today, and her Gathering of Nations basket was, again, an important sightline as you first came into the galleries. You got this invitation to learn about rematriation. We see 11 different women wearing regalia from their communities and holding miniature baskets woven in the style that their communities would have woven, which is very difficult. In general, miniatures are extremely difficult to make, but then doing all of these different weaving styles is truly a technical marvel. So it's a wonderful opportunity, or it invites a lot of interesting discourse. And it's also paired with a case of historical baskets, which you see there. And those were great. Like, it's great to have that cross-temporal dialogue. Carol is making work today, and we get to see these other women artists' work that was created in the late 19th and early 20th century, and think about what the environments were that these women makers were operating within, what was their relationship with the plant relatives that they utilized in these baskets, and how can we see that today? What can we learn from them today? Now let's talk a bit about gratitude. So for longer than memory, Haudenosaunee people who are based in and around New York have stated words of gratitude, also known as the Thanksgiving address, greetings to the natural world, before anything important. These words establish gratitude as the highest priority and remind us that everything in our world is subject to the same forces. The concept of gratitude helps us find a way of being in the world because it generates inexhaustible wealth and contentment. It reminds us that everything needed to support life sustainably can be found in nature and centers abundances rather than scarcity. This revolutionary idea reveals our potential to reciprocally connect with things outside of ourselves and build meaningful relationships grounded in empathy, even with non-human relations. So I worked with a wonderful designer, Kati Huertas, to present this in the galleries. This is displayed next to an enormous Bierstadt painting where we really wanted to kind of balance the presentation, make sure that Native voices had an equally forceful presence in the galleries. So we have this layout of the Thanksgiving address, and at its core, we have a case where we can present different cultural belongings. We have some 19th century moccasins there that are have quill work on them, and you can actually see the footprint of the person that once wore them on the bottom. And for the first installation or first rotation, we paired that with Hayden Haynes and Samantha Jacobs' bag New Beginnings, which was my first purchase acquisition. Both of those artists are acclaimed traditional artists within their community. Hayden is reviving antler comb carving. And Samantha works across quill work, animal hair embroidery, and beadwork. And so they brought those artistic energies to that wonderful bag. And one great story that I love to share in relationship with that bag is Hayden had dreamt of creating this for years, but never wanted to buy a fawn hide because he wanted to know about the life of the animal. He was concerned if he bought a fawn hide that the animal may have been killed just to make the hide. So his wife came across a fawn that was recently killed in a road accident, and Hayden went over, scooped it up, and celebrated its life with the creation of this bag. Then two more things I want to mention. I know I've got 5 minutes, but I think I can do it. So I also like to invite community members in to guide collection care. And this takes many different forms depending on the community, depending on the people coming and the needs of the particular belongings. But a really good example of some early work I did was, we had some Osage folks coming into town, and they requested to see this peyote, what we once called a rattle, that was associated with one of their ancestors. And they came in and spoke to this item in Osage, and it just really raised the question in my mind of when was the last time this cultural belonging got to hear its language, got to be held by someone who understands that broader context. And during our consultation process, one of the visitors said, a lot of times museums call these rattles, but we feel like rattle is misrepresents it. It makes it seem like it's a toy for babies, when really this is a object with a lot of spiritual resonance and value, and we would prefer for you to call it a gourd. So we went into our museum database and updated that right away to reflect that request, and make sure that we're presenting things in the way that they want to be presented and that their community wants. One other example of collection care is over the course of my time here, we have established a repatriation policy for communities that aren't covered by the law I mentioned earlier, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA. Because Gitga'athla Nation is over the border into Canada, like 90 kilometers above the United States, they do not get to benefit from NAGPRA. And we think that's unfair, and that we also don't want to invent a whole new set of rules to consider repatriation for communities that live so close, where a lot of these values are shared. So we decided to extend NAGPRA over the border. And so our first First Nations repatriation was of the gambling mat you can see here, and the sticks that are still in the box. This was a 19th century belonging affiliated with a very important chief, Shakes. And the community, it fulfilled NAGPRA's definitions, and the community requested it for repatriation. So they gathered at the museum, sang songs, led a ceremony here, and actually brought us a new gambling mat to replace the belonging that was leaving, because they wanted to make sure Gitga'athla was still represented in the collection. So this is currently on view in our galleries. And what's next? Hopi Kachina Dolls, Blessings for a Balanced World. So this is a show that Nancy Rossoff has been working on at the museum since 2019. And over the years, she's brought in many different collaborators, including Colleen Lucero, who's a Hopi co-curator. And we've also worked alongside the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office. And we are speaking about the Kachina doll tradition along new lines. And so often Kachina doll presentations focus on carvers, focus on carving styles, focus on culturally inappropriate content. And so through these dialogues, we learned that we shouldn't do that. We didn't want to replicate those models. And that community really wanted us to speak about these gifts through the eyes of the people that receive the gifts. So these are given to infants and girls as they become women. Over the course of their lives, they receive many different tiu, which is the Hopi word, um, that reflect their particular moment that they're receiving. So babies get flat ones that are very simple with safe natural paint. So when they teethe on the dolls, they are ingesting culture in a safe way. And girls get these at very critical moments at different ceremonies up to the time that they are married. And they teach important lessons and they play an incredibly important role within community that extends beyond their ceremonial use. So we often see Kachinam imagery appear in women's artistic practices. We see it across pottery and tiles and basketry and jewelry. And we wanted to bring that conversation together in our galleries. So come visit us starting October 4th. This will be on view through April. And I'm 1 minute over. So I'm going to stop my share. I was almost exactly perfect. And I want to open it up for questions.
Yeah, but first let's give you that virtual round of applause. That was like really wonderful. So thank you so much and very enjoyable. You're getting a lot of love here from the audience.
Super.
Um, so let me open it up straight away actually to the audience. And I have my big list of questions here, as you know, but I'm keen to hear from others. Does anyone have a question for Dare or a comment? And also feel free to type comments in the chat. Cecilia.
Hello there. Thank you so much for this beautiful talk. Sorry, my image is a little bit strange. So I wanted to ask you if you can expand a little bit between the difference between decolonization and indigenization. I'm asking you this because I'm very interested in decolonization, but for example, for me, I cannot really use the term indigenization because I'm not indigenous. So I still have to use, and I know that decolonization, the power of the word is in the colonial. So the colonial idea. So that's why it's still problematical. But I haven't found for like anyone like me who I'm not indigenous, a word that really will function to really mean that.
Yeah, I think decolonization is a very useful shorthand term to point to a lot of different energies. At least within museums, when you say decolonization, it brings up a lot of different ideas at once. I think with Preoccupied, we wanted to be really careful about kind of moving away from colonial narratives. We heard a lot of people, and this is my experience too, feel sad in museums where it's just these narratives of colonial oppression over and over again. And I want to be liberated from that. I want to be able to tell stories that have nothing to do with the colonial agenda or colonization. There are different ways to do that work without using that term. In my case, indigenization makes sense because that's the constituency I'm working with. But I'm not one of the people that's like, we must abandon the term. I think it's still useful, but wasn't useful for the project that I had in mind and the aims. My aims are really different. I think decolonization is a focus on institutions because these are the colonial arms of, in terms of the art world, encyclopedic museums represent colonialism and its values. So if you do want to do an institutional critique, that is an incredibly useful word. But I think honing in on exactly what the aims are and using that as a launching pad to find your perfect word is a smarter approach than using this catch-all term, though I still do use it sometimes. I think it is a very helpful, quick way to get people to understand your agenda. I taught decolonizing design, and that was a class that I came up with Kati, and we named it that because we thought students would sign up and they would understand what our goals were with that course and they would feel invited to participate in those dialogues. I hope that helps.
Any more questions? Well, let me go into my question, and in the meantime, there's a comment in the chat for you as well, which you could read. But given that, we have a lot of emerging curators and art historians in the Zoom today, what for emerging curators and art historians, what skills or forms of training do you think are most necessary? And now I'm going to use Cecilia's word for decolonial curatorial practice today.
Being a good listener. I think it can be hard to hear criticism of institutions and not take it personally. I'm held accountable for decisions that the original curator of my collection area chose. He went on these giant collecting expeditions where he would buy an enormous amount of Native American art. And at times he would just say, "Oh, I bought 20,000 pounds," because that was easier than like counting how many things he bought. So it can be hard to have to reckon with those histories and to be put in a position where, I don't want to ever defend Stuart Cullen, but there are things that would have been lost to time had he not purchased them. He did actually do what he thought was right in that moment. He believed that Native American culture was being really kind of assimilated into white culture, and that these cultural belongings would be lost and abandoned if he didn't get them for a museum. Problematic fellow. He did many problematic things, like going in the night and taking things that the community said they did not want to give him and hiding them under blankets. But the amazing thing Cullen did was he wrote that all down in his diaries. So when he went in the night and took something, he would say, "On this night, I went and I took this thing." And so that can actually be used as evidence to support repatriation efforts. That can be very helpful in helping communities understand what sort of materials their ancestors were making in a particular moment. He's also quite quippy in his diaries. I grew up in a town in California that was founded by some really settlers that did terrible things to natives. And I read about it. I was like, what did he think of Chico? What did he think of the Bidwells? And he wrote in one of his lines, "If it were not for her wealth, Annie Bidwell would surely be in an asylum." And so there are moments like that where you're like, okay, I'm kind of on Cullen's side for this sentence, even though he has his problematic histories. So I think trying to separate yourself from the institution. So when people are criticizing, trying to not take that as a personal criticism. This is the situation we're working with. I think also like, being really testing yourself. Is this something I want to do? This can be really heavy work. And do you want to focus on these heavy topics, or are there different areas in the art world where you're not reckoning with these colonial histories? And then on a broader level, math. I always love math. I give that a plug every time. But friendship. This like so much of curatorial work comes down to friendship and being supportive for one another in the field. I run a Native art curators group because in a time of where I was facing a lot of adversity and like reckoning with what it means to work in this field, I had a mentor who saw me through it. And at the time, tearfully, I'm asking, "What can I do to repay you?" And she said, "You can help whoever the next you is. That can be what you contribute." So by running this curators group, we can share knowledge with one another. If ever I'm like, "Ooh, what's up with this artist?" or "Has anyone worked with so and so?" I can ask my group. We can share things that we're excited about. We can share, strategies around repatriations. That can be a really good group to just be a sounding board and listener. And then also, I think that friendships within and without the museum. I'm friends with like the installation folks. So when I ask them for like the eighth time to tweak this little thing and I'm being all persnickety, it's like not as annoying because we're friends and I want to support them to do their best work and they want to support me. So I think that those kinds of relationships help one's be a good person and like advance in this career in an ethical way that is uplifting others.
That's wonderful. Thank you. I think Cecilia has another question.
Yes, I would like to ask you, when you're working with your colleagues, as you explained when they're doing the reinstall of the American galleries, so you are proposing objects and art which traditionally in the museum setting is not considered to be fine arts, the museum quality thing, the traditional mediums of art, and the division that there exists between the crafts and the art has been one of the biggest pests that we have in terms of letting in and considering the kind of aesthetics and conceptual and symbolic value of a lot of. So what are the kind of discussions that you have to do? Because I know that often in curatorial practice, you have to say, okay, you have to demonstrate that this is museum quality. You have to demonstrate that this is worthy to be next to this painting or whatever. So what are the discussions you have? What kind of situations you find yourself in relation to your colleagues? Do you have the agency, the respect, how much you have to explain yourself? I mean, this is important because this is in the position where we all find, you're promoting, I don't know, women, Latinx artists, whatever, is always the same. You have to demonstrate that somehow you're worthy.
That is a sad reality of the art field in general, and something we actually reckoned with Deani Whitehawk's show in the Preoccupied suite. So Deani, that show presented her Carrie series, which featured copper buckets that were lavishly adorned with beadwork and extremely long, kind of arboreal fringe. And that called into question the ways in which Native art is often relegated to craft. And that is, that has many ripple effects. I think then it sort of separates it from fine art discourse, which is very problematic. And it also limits artists' ability to reach certain audiences, and it also limits how much their work will be valued. So I think craft is often weaponized against Native and particularly Native women artists. And I find I have a lot of allyship at the museum. I hope that as people are going into the museum field, that it's shifted over, even just over the last couple of decades. There have been enormous shifts where craft is no longer relegated to the second class, like, underneath the fine arts. That people are more open to those discussions now than I think previous generations of curators were. And then bringing people along, like getting them excited through the friendship, taking them to openings, showing them exciting work, explaining why this is so innovative, and doing that in a caring way, I think can bring folks along who maybe instinctively weren't on side. I'm like very persistent, and it can be annoying at times, but I will always be kind, and we will get there so everybody appreciates this work as much as it deserves.
Go ahead, Ninaba.
Hey there.
Hello, good to
Long
see
time no
you.
see. You too. Thank you for giving this talk today. I was so excited when Amanda booked you, so to speak.
Aw.
But I was really curious. You mentioned sort of remediating the catalog record, especially with the rattle. And
Mhm.
I have worked in museums in the past where I've wanted to do something similar, and I've been told that I can't undo generations of history or generations of cataloging. And I was curious if you've ever met any sort of like internal resistance to some of the strategies that you're employing or things that you're doing and how you deal with that.
Yeah, so I think being a black belt TMS user helps a lot. So I'm sure many of you, if you are working at museums, TMS is the database tool that a lot of folks use or institutions use. And at my previous institution, we had very limited support on there. So like if I wanted to change a culture name, so it wasn't like, whatever term that is not the preferred term, I could just go in and do it. That is not the case at the Brooklyn Museum, but people are very open here. And the way I personally would try to get around that issue is say, we're not erasing anything. You can go to the audit history. We can like take scrupulous notes on this title changed from X to Y based on our conversation with blah, blah, blah people on this date in which they informed us that rattle is an insensitive term and we must say gourd. So that way you're backing it up with, you know, documentation. So it's not actually disappearing. It's just moving into a different field. So it can live in a field like curatorial remarks or historical attributions. You can tell I use TMS way too much. I'm a power user. But stuff doesn't disappear. It just moves into a different backward facing, not public facing area of the database. So we can make sure that what is public facing is appropriate, because if people see a term like Anasazi, for example, that is a term that is not used anymore in like new scholarship. Ancestral Pueblo is the preferred term. So when I search, though, that culture name, it still pulls up all the records because it's one of the alternate names, but it's hidden from the public. So it's if they are looking on our website, they see Ancestral Pueblo ceramics. They don't see that term anymore. So I think that's being really good at database is a good skill, because you can say, oh, actually, I don't want to delete it. I'm not getting rid of institutional history. I just want to move it into this particular field because blah, blah, blah. And then you like cite the TMS handbook, or like, you know, if you can say historical attributions is defined as this, and that's what it should be because it fits this definition, I think that is a better angle, because we're getting people on board. We're showing we're using their tool the way they want us to use it, and making sure that whatever's public facing is going to not offend people.
Thank you, Dare. Thank you for being here
Get those
today.
TMS workshops
The
under our belts.
certifications, yeah.
Oh, so I wish we had more time for a conversation, but our time together has come to a close. We're at the hour here. So I want to remind everyone we have our sixth and final Navigating Change in the Museum lecture next Thursday, which I believe is the 23rd, with Anthony Kendall, and he's the director of the Museum of Contemporary Art in Denver. And it's at the same time from 1 to 2 p.m. So please join us for the last one. And in the meantime, let's show our love once again to Dare for being here with us today and sharing her work and her brilliance at the Brooklyn Museum, and all the best for your upcoming projects. We're very excited. Thanks,
Thank you.
Dare.
Thanks so much for inviting me. This has been a great dialogue, and I hope you all come visit me. If you end up in Brooklyn, give me an email and we can do a tour.
We will do that. Thank you so much. And thanks
Okay.
everyone for coming today. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.